Hi everyone, Sam here, welcome to my channel. Well, my art studio is a bit of a mess at the moment, and it's such a beautiful autumn day out here in Queenstown, New Zealand, that I thought why not do the introduction to this video outdoors on the lakefront, because the view behind me is the feature of this particular painting tutorial. So last year I was commissioned to do a painting of that view. So in this video I'm going to show you how to paint mountains, water and trees, three great subjects for a landscape painting. I'll show you the composition and design behind the painting and the colours that I used. I'll also show you the blocking in stage, and then I'll give you some specific tips on painting mountains, water and trees. And then we'll wrap up the video by adding the final details which brings the painting together. If you like this video, be sure to hit the subscribe button, and also check the link below. There's some written notes that accompany this video. If you want to have a go at painting this yourself, feel free to copy the painting and use the photos, it's all good. Anyway, bust out your paintbrushes and let's roll the tape. I'm working on a 40 by 70 centimetre canvas and I'm using oil paints. And as you can see there, I've toned the canvas with a layer of burnt sienna, which helps to warm up the painting, and it also adds some vibrancy to the colours. So I start sketching out my composition with burnt sienna and a number 1 round brush, and I've mixed it with a bit of liquid. And what liquid does is it not only thins the paint, but it also speeds up the drying. So normally my painting should be touch dry within 24 hours, which is really useful if I want to paint quickly. Now, this particular view in Queenstown is very well known, and it's been photographed and painted many times. It's a beautiful view, but from a composition perspective it's a little bit tricky. Now, normally when I paint landscapes I usually move things around to improve the composition, but what with this particular view being so well known, it's a lot more tricky to move things without it being obvious. The lake and mountains in this area are stunning and beautiful, and I always want to paint them. But from a composition perspective, I've always found it really tricky to get harmony and rhythm into my paintings. So I was thinking about how could I make this particular painting a bit more harmonious. And what I decided to do was look at some old paintings from my favourite 19th century painters and see if I could get some ideas of how I could approach my painting. And one of my favourite painters from the 19th century was a German painter called August Wilhelm Lew, and he was born in 1818. He painted lots of scenes of Norway that featured high mountains, lakes and fjords, so I had a look at his paintings and it gave me some ideas of how I could approach my own painting. One of the things that I love about August Wilhelm Lew's paintings is the way he achieved the low chroma depth in his mountains. Chroma refers to how saturated a colour is, and Lew had a way of making his mountains recede in the painting yet still look vibrant, organic and colourful at the same time. I've incorporated a similar design to one of Lew's paintings in my own painting here, and I've made Deer Park Heights and the Remarkables Mountains in the background the main focal area of the painting. The supporting elements in the painting, including the rocks, the willow trees and the direction of the clouds, adds a bit of flow and rhythm to the composition overall. The colours I'm using for this painting include titanium white, burnt sienna, yellow oxide, cadmium yellow, cadmium orange, perylene crimson, ultramarine blue and phthalo green. In order to paint this landscape, I'm using a range of flat brushes, rounds and dagger brushes. So now that I've finished sketching out the composition, I start blocking in the painting. Using a number 10 flat brush, I start blocking in the shadow areas of the Remarkables Mountains in the background. And these mountains are going to set the scene for the whole painting, because I'm going to gauge my light and dark values from this shadow area. So I mix the shadow colours of this mountain with a combination of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, which helps to take out some of the saturation of the blue. Then I tint it a bit with a little bit of perylene crimson, and then I mix in titanium white to lighten the value. Now, value just refers to how light or dark a colour is. Next, I get straight into the clouds, and using a number 10 flat brush and titanium white mixed with liquid, I start painting the highlights and forming the shape of the clouds. Immediately afterwards, I start applying a cloud shadow mix, which is a combination of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, perylene crimson and titanium white, the same colours I was using for the shadows in the Remarkables mountains. So now I'm just blending my cloud shadow mix with the highlights that I just applied earlier, and then I use my brush just to blend and form the basic shapes of the clouds while still on the canvas. I mix the colours of the sky with a combination of ultramarine blue, a very small amount of phthalo green and titanium white. Then, once I've painted the sky, I then focus my attention on the areas of the Remarkables mountain where the sun is illuminating the rock faces. For this, I'm using a combination of yellow oxide, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, a tiny bit of perylene crimson if required, and a lot of titanium white. I have to be mindful to create a low chroma colour mix for the mountain highlights here, because if the colours are too saturated, they'll just jump forward in the painting and then the illusion of depth will be lost. For the next stage in this painting, I'll start focusing on the midground and the trees as well. So I start with Deer Park Heights, which is that hill there, and I start by painting the shadows. This is a combination of ultramarine blue, yellow oxide, a bit of perylene crimson and a tiny bit of titanium white. As Deer Park Heights is in the midground, the shadows are going to be darker than that of the Remarkables mountains in the background. For the tree shadows, I pretty much use the same colours, ultramarine blue and yellow oxide as my base, and then mixing in some burnt sienna. The shadows in the trees are likely to be some of the darkest values in the painting. So using a number 8 flat brush, I start focusing on the grass on Deer Park Heights. It's that lovely meadow green colour that you get in early summer, but because it's in the midground, I need to be careful that I don't make the green too saturated, otherwise it will jump forward in the painting. So I start by mixing a combination of ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow, which I'm going to use as my base. I now need to reduce the saturation of the green, and I do this by adding in some yellow oxide, some titanium white, and then I also add some colours that contain the opposite to green on the colour wheel, so colours that contain red. And this can include cadmium orange, perylene crimson and burnt sienna. When using a colour opposite in order to balance out the green a little, I often use cadmium orange and a little perylene crimson mixed together, and then mix that in with the green. Moving on to the willow trees, I use a number 8 flat brush and a combination of ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow, which again I've used as my base. Then I add in a bit of cadmium orange and perylene crimson to the green, just to make it look more organic and natural. Also, if I need to lighten the value, I can add in a little titanium white. Now at this stage of the painting, I'm really not concerned with detail whatsoever, so I'm using very broad gestural brush strokes to block in the basic colour of the trees. One thing to keep in mind when you're painting trees is that the foliage is generally darker in value than grass, and you can clearly see this in my reference photo here. This was one of the photos I used for this painting. Moving on to the water, I start adding this with a number 8 flat brush, and this is just a combination of ultramarine blue, a tiny bit of yellow oxide, a tiny bit of phthalo green and a lot of titanium white. I'm making sure I leave some gaps in the water so that I can paint in the reflections of the willow trees, And again, as with the trees, I'm not concerned about detail whatsoever, I'm just getting in that basic colour. I paint in the shadows of the rocks, which is a combination of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, a bit of perylene crimson. And then for the areas of the rocks that are in light, I use the same colours but with more titanium white and also a little bit of yellow oxide. I complete the blocking in stage by painting in the grass, which is the same colours that I used for the willow trees, but I've added a bit more titanium white to lighten the value. After that, I allow the painting to dry so I can then begin the next stage, which is building up the detail in the painting. Now, given that there's a lot to cover in this short video, for the rest of the painting tutorial I'm just going to focus on the mountains, the water and the trees, so I hope you get some good tips from this that you can apply to your own painting. So, using a number 6 flat brush and the same colours that I use in the blocking in phase but with more titanium white, I start defining the form of the Remarkables mountains in the background. Now, the one thing I'm quite conscious of is I don't want to add too much detail in it because it will be a bit of a distraction in the painting. So as it's in the distance, I'm going to keep the detail to a minimum. I also add some reflected light in the shadow areas of the mountain, and I'm using the same colours that I used in the blocking in phase but with a tiny bit more titanium white just to lighten the value a little bit. And I'll be sharpening up the rock shadows as I go along in the painting. At this stage in the painting I've done quite a lot of work on the clouds and the background mountains and also Deer Park Heights, that hill in the midground. So next I focus my attention on the water. Now, there's no doubt that water can be a pretty complex structure and a challenge to paint for any artist. So what I normally do when it comes to painting water is just try and break it down into its component parts. So the first thing I approach is the shadows, and if you take a look at the reference photo here, you can see these shadows and the ripples. And I think of those ripples as little hills with the light shining behind it, so the face of the ripple is in shadow. Using a number 2 flat brush and a combination of ultramarine blue with some yellow oxide, I start forming the shadows of the ripples. So now that I've established the main part of the shadows in the water, the next component to focus on are the peaks and the troughs. So if we just take a look at our reference photo again, you'll see that the peaks and the troughs of the water here are mostly reflecting the sky and the mountains, and they're lighter in value. So again, using a number 2 flat brush and a mixture of ultramarine blue with a little yellow oxide and a lot of titanium white, I start forming the peaks and troughs of the water that are reflecting the sky and mountains. And in general, I paint these directly behind the shadows of the ripples. So if we think of those little ripples as hills again, the areas I'm painting are the areas that are in light. So now I just need to leave the water to dry before I can add some detail to it at the end of the painting. So next I focus my attention on the willow tree in the foreground. The first thing that I do is I mix up a green that I'm going to use for the foliage in the tree, and I'm actually using the same combination that I use in the blocking in stage. So I'm using cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue as my base, and then I'm going to harmonise and earth that green by mixing in colours that contain a complementary opposite to green, which could include cadmium orange, perylene crimson, even burnt sienna, as all these colours contain red, which is the complementary opposite to green on the colour wheel. And then also, if I want to increase the saturation, I can also add a little bit of phthalo green into the mix. Using a 3/8 of an inch dagger brush, I start expanding the form of the canopy there and feathering the foliage. And using the same brush, I also reinforce those shadows within the tree. And the shadows, as I said earlier, are going to be some of the darkest values in the painting. In order to build up the detail of the tree canopy, I'm going to be using a combination of number 2 flat brushes, number 1 rounds and 3/8 of an inch dagger brushes. With each progressive pass of the foliage I'm going to be adding lighter tones, so I'm still using those same colours I used to mix the green, but I'll be adding more titanium white in order to lighten the value. I built up the detail of this willow tree over several days, and the advantage of using Liquid Original as my medium to thin the paint is that it speeds up the drying, so my painting was touch dry by the following day, which means I could carry on adding more detail to the foliage. I find the dagger brushes very useful in painting tree foliage, as you can use the tips to paint the suggestion of individual leaves, which is what I did with this tree. Using a number 2 flat brush and a combination of titanium white mixed with a little bit of burnt sienna, I start adding some of the snow on top of the Remarkables mountains. Adding a bit of burnt sienna to the titanium white just helps the snow recede, so it's not jumping forward in the painting. After painting the snow on the mountains, I turn my attention back to the willow tree. And using my sky mix, I start filling in some of those negative spaces around the foliage, which helps emphasise the form of the canopy of the tree overall. I paint the areas of snow that are in shadow on the Remarkables mountains using a combination of ultramarine blue, a little bit of perylene crimson and titanium white. And then I turn my attention again back to the tree and start painting in the branches and the main stems. For this I've used a combination of ultramarine blue with burnt sienna and a tiny bit of perylene crimson, and then for the areas of the trunk that are illuminated I've used the same colours but added a lot more titanium white. I'm now at the stage of the painting where it's all starting to come together, and all that's left to do is to add final highlights and details. I save my lightest values until the end of the painting, so here I'm just adding a few highlights on the leaves of the willow tree. I also paint in the suggestion of fine twigs with a small round brush. Using a number 1 round brush, I paint some highlights on the rocks where the sun's reflecting on the wet surface. And then I also paint the houses on Deer Park Height, which is an important detail in this view. I add some white water to where these small waves are crashing on the lake foreshore. And in general, I just tidy up the water by adding some more highlight to the peaks and troughs where required. And with that, the painting is complete. So before I end the video, I'll just go over some of the key points that I covered. Obviously there's quite a lot going on in this painting and I wasn't able to cover everything, so I've just focused on some key areas which included the water, the mountains and the trees. So in general, when I'm blocking in the painting, the main thing I want to establish is the whole tonality of the painting and the colours. So I use as bigger brushes as I can get away with to give it that more painterly effect, but also so I can cover ground quickly. And so long as all my colours and tones match up in the blocking in stage, I'm generally pretty happy, and it's much easier to then work on the detail afterwards. When painting the mountains, I was conscious of the fact that I didn't want it overly detailed because otherwise this would just be confusing on the eye. And overall I've used low chroma colours. Painting water can be pretty tricky as it's such a complex thing to paint. So I always just break it down into its component parts, and I treat the ripples like little hills that in this case are backlit. The troughs and peaks of the water are reflecting the sky and the mountains, and so they're going to be lighter in value. I used a combination of dagger brushes and number 2 flat brushes to paint the foliage of the trees, which I built up in successive layers, which helps create the form of the tree. And finally, I always save my lightest values and details till the end of the painting. One last thing I might add, that I think if there's one thing I would do to improve this composition was perhaps I would have added a boat in the lake just to add a bit more of a focal point. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you found it useful. If you did, hit the subscribe button below, and also don't forget to click the link below for the written notes that accompany this video if you want to have a go at painting it. If you want to see more of my art, then check out my website, which is samuelerp.com, and I'm also on social media, including Instagram, which I post to frequently, so if you just type in Samuel Earp Artist, you'll find me there, and I'm also on Facebook. Anyway, as I say, I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, I will see you then for more videos. Bye!